So we have a first version of our authentication microservice up and running in Docker. And we have a database with some information in it. And the next step, before we can actually try this out, is to modify the broker application to the broker microservice to listen for a request from the front end, then fire a request off to the authentication microservice, receive the response from the microservice, and send some kind of response back to the end user. So to do that, in the broker service, I'm going to open the routes.go file, and I'll set up a route that goes to a handler that doesn't exist yet. So I'll leave the one we have here now, that test route at the /URL, and I'll put another one here, mux.post, and I'll call this one /handle. Okay, it'll handle all requests. A single point of entry, doesn't matter what microservice we're trying to deal with, this is the URL we'll call. And that will go to a handler that doesn't exist yet called app.handleSubmission. Okay, so we have that. Now, let's go over and create that handler. Over in handlers.go, first of all, create an empty func app with a pointer to config as the receiver. And I'll call this handle submission and give it the response writer and the pointer to the request. Okay. And I need an R there. Okay. So that's my stub. Now, before we start working on this, since we're going to have a single point of entry to the broker service /handle, that means that we're going to have some kind of agreed upon JSON format. So let's create a type for that right now. Doesn't matter what we're sending. It's going to be in a predictable JSON format. So I'll create a type up here and I'll call it request payload. And it's just a struct. And it's going to have, first of all, a field called action. What do you want me to do? And that's a string. And in JSON, I'll call that action. Okay? So that's the first thing. And then I'm going to create a different type for each of the possible actions. So we'll have one for auth, which we're going to do right now. And then we'll have one for mail and one for log and so on and so forth. Okay? So let's just do the first one right now. I'll call it auth. And it's going to be of a type that doesn't exist yet called auth payload. And in JSON, I'll call that auth, and I'll omit it when it's not there. So omit empty. Okay? Now, let's create the type for auth payload. Type auth payload, right there. It's a struct. And what do we need in order to authenticate? Well, all we need is the email and the password. So let's put in email, which is a type string. And in JSON, that's called email. And password, which is also a string. And in JSON, we'll call that password. Because that's the format, that's the only information we need in order to authenticate. So there are my types. Now, in the actual handler, what we're going to do is, of course, read into a variable of type request payload, the JSON that we receive. So we'll create a variable, and I'll call it request payload. And it's of type request payload with a capital R. Okay? And now we'll check for an error when we read that JSON in. app.readJSON. And we're going to read using W and R, and we're going to read into request payload. And if there's an error, we send back the appropriate response. If error is not equal to nil, then we'll say app.errorJSON, and we'll give it W and the error, and we'll just return because we can't go any further. But once we get past that, we actually want to take a different action based upon the kind of JSON we're receiving or the contents of the JSON we're receiving. So if you look at the request payload type, we have the first field called action. So all we have to do is switch on request payload.action. So switch, and we're going to switch on request payload.action. And we'll have one case for each of the things we want to do. So we'll do the one we're dealing with right now. Case is auth. And what do we want to do if we're actually going to have that case? I'll just put the default in here right now. So default would be, I don't know what the action is. So we'll say app.errorJSON and give it W and create a new errors.new. And we'll just say unknown action. Okay? What we want to do in auth is actually authenticate. And I could put all the necessary logic in here, but that's really awkward. So let's create a new function down here called func with the receiver of app pointer to config, not chan, config. And we'll call this one authenticate. And in order to do the things we need to do, we need to have a response writer. So we'll just take w, http.responseWriter. And we're also going to need the actual payload. So we'll call that a auth payload. Okay, that's what this is going to receive. And what we'll do here is, first of all, let's just write some comments. We'll create some JSON. We'll send to the auth microservice. So that's the first thing we'll do. Then we'll call the service. And then we're going to have to make sure we get back the correct status code. Okay, so let's get started. Up here, there's more things to do, but this is enough to get us started. Let's create some JSON. So JSON data is the variable name I'm going to use. I'll ignore the error. And that's assigned the value by calling JSON dot, and I'll use Marshall indent just to make it nice and readable. Okay. And I'm going to Marshall indent my payload that I'm receiving right up here, the auth payload. And I'll have no prefix. And I'll put everything in with one tab. That'll make some nicely formatted JSON. Okay, so we have that. Now we want to call our auth service. So to do that, I'm actually going to have to build the equivalent of an HTTP request, because we're actually going to call that. So what I'll do is I'll create a variable. Let me get rid of this blank line. I'll create a variable that I'll call request. And I'll check for an error when I call HTTP, right out of the standard library, dot new request. Okay? And that request will be of type post, because that's what the authentication service is looking for. It has to have some URL. And the URL in our case is going to be just http:// and then whatever we named the authentication service in our Docker Compose YML file. And we called that authentication-service. Okay? And then what URL do we want to hit on the back end? Well, if you recall, it's authenticate. Authenticate. So that's our URL. And now we also need to put in our JSON file, but it needs to be in a specific format. And the easiest way to do that is just to use the bytes package built into the standard library and use new buffer, and put in JSON data. Okay, so we'll check for an error. We'll just say if error is not equal to nil, then app.errorJSON, and we'll give it the W and the error, and we'll just return. Okay, so now we have a request. Now we can actually call the service, and we do that by creating an HTTP client, which I'll call client. That's assigned the value of a reference to http.client. And now we call the client with the request. So we'll get a response and potentially an error when we call client.do, and we just give it a request, the one we built right up there in line 51. And again, we check for an error. So I'll copy this stuff and paste this in here. Now, once I have that response, of course, I'm going to be doing something with the body, and I don't want to leave that open. So I'll use defer, our handy defer command, response.body.close. And now let's get rid of these blank lines, because this is the point where we make sure that we get back the correct status code. So we'll say if response.statuscode, if it's equal to http.status unauthorized, okay, then they're not authorized. So we'll send back the appropriate response. And all we have to do is say app.errorJSON with W and errors.new. I'll build my own error response, and I'll just say invalid credentials. You can say whatever you want. and we return. Else, the other case we need to trap for to make sure they're not actually authenticating is if the response status code is not equal to status accepted. So we'll say, well, I should make it really clear by putting else if in there. Else if response.statuscode is not equal to http.statusAccepted. Okay, just to make it absolutely clear what's going on here, we can call the same thing here and paste it in. And the comment I'll put in, or the response I'll put in, is the one that makes the most sense. And it's simply error calling auth service. I don't want to give too much information away. And this is enough. If we're not getting status accepted back and we're not getting status unauthorized back, then something went wrong. And that's enough. Okay? Now, if we get past all of that, let's create a variable. We'll read response.body into. Okay, and this response, of course, is coming from the authentication service. So I'll create a variable, and I'll just call it JSON from service, and I'll make it of type JSON response, because that's what we're going to get. Okay, and now I'll decode the JSON from the auth service. And we know how to do that. That's pretty simple. Error is equal to JSON.newDecoder. And I'm going to decode response.body. Decode into JSON from service. Right there. Okay, so that gives us some JSON to work with. And we'll check for an error. So I'll just copy this stuff right here and paste it right here and scroll up a bit. And the next thing to check once we have that JSON is there some kind of error? If JSON from service dot error. Try that again. From service dot error. That's better. If that's set to true, then what we're going to do here is to send the error JSON back, okay? And all I'll do is just say app.errorJSON, w, whatever the error is, and I'll give it the, I got too many parentheses there, w, whatever the error is, and I'm going to give it a specific status, http.status unauthorized, and I'll return. But if we get past that, then we have a valid login, okay? And what we want to send back to the end user is a payload with whatever information we want. So let's create var payload. And I'll make this JSON response. That's our type. And I'll say payload.error is equal to false, because there is no error. We'll give it a message. Payload.message is equal to authenticated. That's enough. And I also want to give it some data, payload.data, and that's going to be equal to JSON from service.data. So we're going to give the error set to false, a message, which is just a string authenticated, and then the actual data from the service itself. And of course, that's our user. And I just write that out. So I say app.writeJSON, and I write w, http.statusAccepted, and I give it payload. Okay? So now we've created this authenticate function. Let's go back up here to our case auth and actually call it. So what we have to do is say app.authenticate, and we give that the response writer, and we give it the appropriate part of a request payload, which is just the auth, which just has an email and password in it. So that is request payload.auth. And if we did everything right, I think we're at the point where we can actually go to the front end and make a call to the broker, to the appropriate URL with the appropriate JSON payload, have the broker call the authentication microservice, get the response back, and send whatever we get back from the authentication microservice back to the end user via the broker. All right, we'll start on the front end in the next lecture.